The people closest to us can sometimes hand us the sharpest betrayals wrapped in the language of protection and friendship. I have thought about that a lot since everything changed. When the quiet life I had built on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain began to crack. It did not happen in a crowded room or at a dramatic gathering. It arrived in a certified envelope on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, delivered to the door of my lakeside manor while I was finishing a client call. My name is Sophia Ellison, and I am 35 years old. For years, I had worked as a freelance marketing strategist and occasional ghostwriter, keeping my circle small and my days steady. The manor was my sanctuary, the result of careful choices rather than sudden windfalls. I let very few people all the way inside that piece. Jessica Harlan was one of them. She had been my best friend for 5 years. Ryan Caldwell had been my boyfriend for 2. I believed the 3 of us formed something reliable. I was wrong. If any of this feels familiar to you, I hope you will stay with me as I tell what happened next. The courier handed me the thick envelope just after lunch. I signed for it without suspicion. Inside were formal legal papers filed by Ryan, accusing me of defamation, theft of intellectual property, and harassment against Jessica. The documents demanded I sign a non-disparagement agreement, cease all contact with Jessica, and stay away from certain professional circles in New Orleans or face a lawsuit. The language was precise and cold. It claimed I had been spreading false stories about Jessica's business to mutual contacts, and that I had stolen a workshop concept she had supposedly created on her own. I read the pages 3 times. Each time the words felt more unreal. I called Jessica immediately. Her voice on the other end was not the warm, familiar one I had known for years. It was tight and rehearsed. She told me I had crossed a line by sharing details of her struggles with clients who could have helped her. She said I had made her look incompetent and that Ryan was only doing what any decent person would do to protect someone he cared about. When I asked what she was talking about, she said the papers spoke for themselves. If I did not sign within 48 hours, she would make sure everyone in our professional community knew exactly what kind of friend I really was. The call ended before I could answer. I sat at my desk with the papers spread out the lake, visible through the windows, and felt the first deep fracture in everything I had trusted. Ryan did not answer when I called. His text arrived 2 hours later. It was short. He told me to just sign the papers and not make things harder than they had to be. That was when the full weight settled. Not only the legal threat, but the realization that the man who had shared this house and my confidences had aligned himself with the person rewriting my story. I did not sign. I called David Sullivan, the lawyer a colleague had recommended for contract matters. He reviewed everything and said the claims were thin, but clearly meant to intimidate. He advised me to document every interaction and avoid direct contact until we had a clear strategy. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the light fade over the water. The house felt larger and quieter than it ever had. I had spent years being the reliable one, the one who listened, who helped without keeping score. Now the person I had trusted most with that role was using it against me. The professional world I had navigated so carefully was already shifting. A colleague I had worked with for 2 years sent a polite email canceling a joint project. Another contact mentioned in passing that Jessica had been sharing concerns about my reliability. The gossip was quiet at first, but it spread through our small circle in New Orleans with surprising speed. Invitations thinned, referrals slowed. People who had once welcomed collaboration now sent careful, distant replies. I reached out to Brandon Hayes, a mutual friend who had known both Jessica and me since the early days. We met for coffee at a quiet spot near the lake. Brandon looked uncomfortable the moment he sat down. He said he had something difficult to share. The day before, he had been at a coffee shop when Jessica was there on the phone. He had not intended to listen, but the conversation was clear enough in the quiet space. Jessica had been speaking with someone about the legal papers. She admitted the claims were exaggerated, that the workshop idea had actually originated with me during one of our late-night strategy sessions, and that Ryan had suggested using legal pressure to force me to back off so she could claim the full credit and the income that might come from it. Brandon had recorded part of the call because he was shocked by what he heard. He sent me the file later that evening. The person who sent that recording turned out to be an ally I had not fully recognized until then. In that moment, sitting across from Brandon, the pieces locked together with painful clarity. Jessica had not simply betrayed a confidence. She had constructed a story to justify taking something that had never been hers alone. Ryan had chosen to stand beside her in that construction. The legal papers were never about protection. They were about control. I thanked Brandon and asked him to keep what he had heard between us for now. He agreed. When I returned to the manor that afternoon, the Spanish moss on the oaks and the calm stretch of water looked the same, yet everything felt different. The porch, the rooms filled with books and work. The sanctuary I had built, they were still mine. The people I had let inside had chosen their path. I was choosing mine. I did not know yet how far the gossip would travel or what the full cost would be. I only knew I would not sign those papers. I would not disappear quietly to protect a narrative that was never true. The days that followed brought more distance from old contacts, more polite cancellations, more evidence that the story Jessica and Ryan were telling was taking root in certain corners of our professional world. But it also brought a quiet resolve. I began gathering my own documentation emails, messages, dated notes from our collaborations, not to attack, but to protect the truth if it ever came to light. I met with David again. None of the options were easy. All of them required me to accept that some relationships were already lost. That was the hardest part, not the legal threat, not the spreading whispers. The quiet understanding that the best friend I had confided in and the boyfriend I had built a life with had decided I was the obstacle to their version of success. I walked the grounds that evening, the humid New Orleans air thick around me, and thought about what it meant to choose peace over loyalty when loyalty had become a one-way demand. I did not have every answer yet, but I knew I would not return to pretending everything was fine. The cold fallout had started, and I was still standing inside the home I had earned. The question that stayed with me as the light faded over the lake was how much more it would cost before the people I had trusted finally showed the rest of their hands. Would you choose yourself if the people closest to you handed you the papers that tried to rewrite your story? The recording from Brandon sat on my phone like a quiet weight I carried through the next morning. I listened to it twice in the calm of my office, the lake outside my window offering no answers, only the steady rhythm of water against the shore. What I heard confirmed the fracture I had already felt, but made it sharper, more undeniable. Jessica's voice on that recording was not defensive or angry in the way she had been with me. It was calculating, almost relieved, as she explained to whoever was on the other end of the line that the legal papers were meant to create enough pressure for me to step back from the workshop series we had built together in private conversations over many months. She admitted the core idea had come from notes I had shared with her during one of our late-night strategy sessions on this very porch. Ryan had been the one who suggested framing it as theft on my part, so she could move forward without splitting the potential income or credit. Hearing it spoken out loud in her own words stripped away any last thread of denial I had been holding on to. I did not call her back that day. Instead, I drove into New Orleans to meet with David Sullivan again. The city felt different on the short drive across the causeway. The usual hum of traffic and distant music from the French Quarter replaced by a tighter focus on what needed to be done next. David listened to the recording without interrupting. When it finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me the claims in the legal papers were now even weaker than before, but that the real damage was happening in the spaces between formal documents, the quiet conversations and canceled projects that were already costing me opportunities. He advised sending a formal response through his office rather than engaging directly. It would document my position without giving them more material to twist. I agreed. While I was there, Margaret Lawson, my longtime boss at the small agency where I still took occasional contract work, called to check in. She had heard some of the whispers circulating through client circles. Margaret had always been direct. She told me she did not believe the version Jessica was spreading, but that several joint projects we had lined up for the coming months were now on hold because clients were uncomfortable with the tension. She said she would keep the door open for me personally, but she could not afford to let the drama affect the agency's reputation. I thanked her for being honest. The loss of that steady work was another quiet cut, one more piece of the professional network I had spent years building that was fraying because of someone else's narrative. By the time I returned to the manor, the light over the lake had turned golden. I walked the grounds for a while, letting the humid air settle around me before going inside to draft notes for David to use in his response letter. The house felt both protective and strangely exposed at the same time. I had always kept my professional life and my private sanctuary separate. Now the two were bleeding into each other because Jessica and Ryan had decided my boundaries were optional. Later that evening, Ryan finally called. His voice was tired, but still carried the same patronizing edge I had heard in his text. He said I was making everything harder than it needed to be, that Jessica was under enough stress without me dragging things out, and that if I cared about either of them, I would just sign and let everyone move on. I asked him when he had decided that protecting her version of events mattered more than the truth we had both known. He did not answer directly. He told me I was being dramatic and that the papers were simply a tool to create space. I ended the call without raising my voice. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. The gossip continued to spread through our professional circle in New Orleans over the next few days. A client I had worked with for nearly 3 years sent a short formal email ending our retainer, citing a need to realign priorities. Another colleague who had once referred steady work my way stopped returning messages. Patricia Vaughn, the neighbor whose property shared the curve of the lake with mine, noticed the change in my routine. She brought over a plate of fresh beignets one afternoon and sat with me on the porch for a while without asking questions I was not ready to answer. Her quiet presence was one of the few steady things left. I did not tell her the details, but I think she understood something significant had shifted. That same afternoon, Jessica called again. Her voice was different this time, less rehearsed, more frayed at the edges. She said her own client pipeline had started drying up because some of the people she had spoken to about me were now asking questions she could not answer cleanly. She accused me of turning people against her, of using the recording Brandon had shared as some kind of weapon. I told her I had not shared it with anyone outside my lawyer. She did not believe me. The conversation grew sharper. She called me selfish for refusing to sign the papers, said I had always needed to be the one in control, that I could not stand seeing her succeed on her own terms. I listened without interrupting. When she paused for breath, I asked her if she remembered whose notes had formed the foundation of the workshop series in the first place. She hung up. 2 days later, The crisis that had been building finally broke in a way none of us had expected. Jessica called late in the evening, her voice raw and unsteady. She had been drinking, or perhaps she had simply reached the point where the story she had built could no longer hold its own weight. She told me she had never intended for the legal papers to go as far as they had, that Ryan had pushed harder than she expected because he was worried about his own reputation if people found out he had helped shape the claims. She admitted the workshop idea had been mine from the beginning, and that she had only expanded on it after I shared the initial outline with her in confidence. She said she had felt invisible in her own career for so long that claiming the full credit had seemed like the only way to finally be taken seriously. The confession came out in pieces, interrupted by long silences and the occasional sharp breath. I did not record that call. I simply listened. When she finished, I told her I would not be signing the papers and that any further contact should go through David. She did not argue. She simply said she was sorry in a voice so small it barely carried across the line, then ended the call. I sat with that conversation for a long time afterward, the phone still in my hand, the lake dark and still outside the windows. The full confession had not brought the relief I might have expected. It had only made the loss more final. Jessica had chosen a path that required erasing my contribution to protect her own image. Ryan had chosen to stand beside her in that erasure. The professional community that had once felt like a loose but reliable web was now thinner, colder in places where trust had once lived. I walked out onto the porch and let the night air settle over me. The manor was still here. The work I knew how to do was still here. What was gone was the illusion that loyalty from the people I had let closest would always be returned in kind. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clear. The next morning, I sent David the notes from Jessica's call and asked him to include them in his formal response. I also reached out to Nicole Brennan, the colleague who had quietly encouraged Brandon to share what he had overheard after he told her he was unsure what to do with the information. She had been the steady hand behind the recording reaching me cleanly. I thanked her without asking for anything more. She told me she had seen similar patterns before and that she hoped I would keep protecting the work I had built. Her words landed with more weight than I expected. The days that followed brought one more escalation I had not fully prepared for. A certified letter arrived from Ryan's lawyer expanding the original claims and adding a new demand that I stay away from any future professional events where Jessica might be present. It was another layer of pressure dressed as protection. I read it on the porch while the morning light moved across the water. Instead of the panic they might have hoped for, I felt a quiet, steady anger that did not need to be loud to be real. I called David and told him to respond with the full documentation we had gathered, including the recording and the notes from Jessica's confession call. He warned me that doing so would likely end any remaining possibility of a quiet resolution. I told him I understood. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote out everything I had lost in the past 2 weeks, the steady referrals, the collaborative projects, the easy laughter that had once filled this house when Jessica and Ryan were here, the version of myself that had believed closeness meant safety. The list was long. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer. I did not need to keep it. I only needed to remember what it had cost to finally see the people I had trusted clearly. I was still standing. The manor was still mine. The work I knew how to do had not disappeared. But the old support network I had relied on without question was gone, replaced by a thinner, more careful set of connections, and the knowledge that some losses could not be undone. The cold fallout was no longer just beginning. It had settled into the spaces between what I had once called friendship and what I now recognized as something far more fragile. I did not know yet what the formal response from David would bring or how much further Jessica and Ryan would push once they received it. I only knew that whatever came next, I would meet it from inside the boundaries I had finally chosen to defend instead of explaining away. The lake outside my windows remained calm, but the air inside the house had changed. It no longer felt like waiting. It felt like the beginning of something I had not chosen, but could no longer avoid facing head-on. The morning after that final call from Jessica, the house felt both heavier and lighter at once. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and carried it out to the porch, watching the early light move across Lake Pontchartrain. The formal response David had prepared was already on its way. I had given him everything: the recording Brandon had shared, the notes from Jessica's late-night confession, the timeline of canceled projects, and shifting referrals. He warned me again that once the letter landed, the remaining threads of civility would likely snap. I told him I was ready for that. What I was not ready for was how much the silence afterward would ask of me. David's letter went out that afternoon. It laid out the documented conversations, the origin of the workshop concept in my own notes, and the pattern of professional damage that had followed the legal papers. It did not demand anything dramatic. It simply stated that any further claims would be met with a full record of what had actually occurred. The reply came 2 days later through Ryan's lawyer. It was shorter than I expected. The additional demands were withdrawn. The original papers were not formally dropped, but they were no longer being pursued with the same urgency. Jessica had apparently realized the recording and her own words on the phone created too much risk. Ryan, for his part, stopped calling. The last message I received from him was a single line asking me to respect Jessica's need for space. I did not answer. That small act of silence felt like the first real boundary I had drawn without apology. The professional fallout did not reverse itself. Margaret Lawson kept her word and left a door open for occasional contract work, but the joint projects we had planned stayed on hold. Several clients who had once reached out regularly now routed their needs through other people. The gossip did not explode into open confrontation, but it lingered in the form of careful distance. Invitations to the small gatherings and collaborative dinners that had once been part of my rhythm in New Orleans became rarer. I did not chase them. I focused instead on the work that still came directly to me and on protecting the quiet rhythm of the manor. Patricia Vaughn continued to bring small gestures and extra plate from her kitchen, a book she thought I might like without ever asking for the story. Her presence reminded me that not every connection required explanation. Kenneth Harper, the therapist I had seen a handful of times over the years when the weight of client work grew heavy, listened without judgment when I finally described what had happened. He did not offer quick comfort. He simply asked what I was willing to carry forward and what I was ready to set down. The questions stayed with me long after the session ended. The clearest loss arrived in the weeks that followed, not through any dramatic scene, but through the gradual understanding that certain doors had closed for good. Jessica and I would not find our way back to the late-night strategy sessions on the porch, or the easy trust that had once let me share half-formed ideas without fear. Ryan would not return to the Sunday mornings that had felt ordinary and safe. The version of friendship and partnership I had believed in had required me to stay smaller than the truth. Once I refused to do that, the relationships could not survive in their old form. Some mutual contacts still sent the occasional polite message, but the warmth that had once accompanied them was gone. The old support network I had taken for granted had thinned into something more careful and conditional. I felt the absence in quiet moments when a referral I would once have received went elsewhere. When a name I used to call easily now required a longer pause before I reached for the phone. The cost was real. It was also the price of refusing to sign my name to a story that erased my contribution and asked me to disappear. I did not pursue a public reckoning or a dramatic countersuit. David handled the formal side with steady precision, and the immediate legal pressure eased. What remained was the slower work of rebuilding trust in the spaces that had been damaged. I turned down one or two opportunities that would have required working closely with people who had believed Jessica's version without question. I accepted others that let me stay in my own lane. The manor became more than a backdrop. It became the place where I practiced the boundaries I had once only theorized about. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had already decided the narrative. I stopped softening my language when clients asked why certain collaborations had ended. The answers I gave were simple and true. Some relationships had run their course, and I was choosing the work that still felt aligned with the life I wanted to keep. One afternoon, several months after the papers first arrived, I received a short message from Nicole Brennan. She had seen the formal response circulate quietly among a few people who had been on the edges of the situation. She wrote that she was glad I had protected what mattered and that she hoped the manor still felt like home. I thanked her and left it at that. The recording she had helped reach me had done its work without needing to become a public weapon. That felt like enough. Jessica never reached out again. Ryan's name disappeared from my phone after one final unanswered message asking if we could talk. I did not call back. The silence that followed was not peaceful in the way people sometimes describe. It was simply clear. I no longer owed either of them the energy of managing their discomfort with the truth. I still sit on this porch most evenings. The water moves against the pilings in the same steady rhythm. The Spanish moss still hangs from the oaks. The house holds the same quiet I fought to protect. What has changed is the shape of the life inside it. I no longer measure my days by how well I can keep everyone around me comfortable. I measure them by whether the work I do and the peace I keep are still mine to claim. The losses remain. There are names I no longer call projects that will never return, and a version of friendship that ended the moment I refused to sign it away. Those absences do not disappear with time. They simply become part of the landscape I now navigate with more care. What has grown in their place is a quieter certainty. I can trust myself to recognize when loyalty has become a demand rather than a choice. I can choose the boundaries that let me keep the home and the work I built, even when that choice thins the circle around me. The lesson I carry from those months is simple and hard at once. Peace does not arrive by keeping everyone happy or by explaining yourself until the people who hurt you finally understand. It arrives when you stop handing over pieces of your story to people who have already decided you are the problem. I chose myself when the legal papers landed and when the gossip spread and when the confession came too late to undo the damage. That choice cost me a friendship I had valued for years and a relationship I had thought was steady. It also returned to me the clarity I had been slowly giving away. I do not regret the cost. I only wish I had seen the price earlier. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If you have ever found yourself holding papers or messages that tried to rewrite what you know to be true, I hope this story reminds you that you do not have to sign them. The people who ask you to disappear so they can keep their version of events are not offering peace. They are offering a smaller life. You are allowed to refuse. Would you choose yourself if the people closest to you handed you the papers that tried to rewrite your story?